It's my honor and my pleasure to introduce Illinois State Senator Sandberg.
Thank you. One of the things the governor has been focused on is let's reform some of these underlying cost drivers, and let's reform some of the things that maybe make Illinois a less attractive place to come, so that maybe we can be one of those jobs leaders rather than one of the jobs laggards, and we can grow revenue that way. Now, one of the other difficult situations we face is the tax burden. That pension situation, 25% of our state budget goes to make the pension payment. In most states, it's 5 to 8%. 25% of $32 billion is $8 billion. If we were down in the 5% range, that's $6 billion more that we would have either to keep tax rates where they are and also to fund our not-for-profits and balance our budget. Contrast between the Democratic Senate President and the Democratic House Speaker, I think, is significant. The Senate Democrats are ideologically much more liberal, I think, than the House Democrats, and yet they're more likely to cooperate and compromise with the Republican governor than the House is. Appreciate very much the opportunity to come back. When you deliver the kind of quality news that you give with a Springfield update, sometimes people aren't real eager to see you again. So I very much appreciate the chance to come back. I really found Andy's presentation, to be frank, very interesting. I was joking at the table for an Irish lawyer politician, which that means we tend more to the verbose side, and we usually run from the specific details of numbers. I found it very interesting how much I enjoyed the presentation, and I was hoping to hear that things were going to be a little more robust, and we'd see the rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing for us economically. Sounds like maybe those of us in government have even more of an incentive to start to do our part to, at least here in Illinois, identify and solve our problems to allow us to dominate economically. I'm going to get in a little bit. I'm going to kind of talk through our strengths, our weaknesses, some of the specifics from a state policy standpoint. But as all of you know, we are in the midst of an unprecedented budget stalemate here in Illinois. And that's unfortunate. There are significant consequences for that. However, and again, this whole speech, to the extent it's not facts, and even those probably some people will dispute, this is my take on the world, so it comes with my particular lens. But let me just start out by making the point there is much that is being made of the fact that Illinois doesn't have a budget, and that Illinois leadership between Governor Romero and Speaker Madigan in particular are in a fight, and there's a stalemate. All of that's true. All of it comes with consequences. All of us, I think most of us, wish that this could be resolved sooner rather than later. But from my perspective, I would rather have a legitimate fight for the future of this state than continue unabated to the cliff as we were before this fight began and Governor Romero was sworn into office. So while this is unfortunate, I do think in the end it's better than steaming toward the cliff, which is what we were doing. And I'll touch on some of those things a little bit as we go along. I always like to start by accentuating the positive. Generally speaking, if you strip aside for a second what you know of state government and how it functions or doesn't function and the outcomes it provides, if you just look at the attributes, traits, strengths of the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago, and compare them in your mind for a second to those of our neighbors, particularly in the Midwest, no one holds a candle to what we have to offer if we start getting policy right and stop shooting ourselves in the foot. Home to more than 400 major corporate headquarters, 31 Fortune 500 companies. Bureau labor statistics, Illinois was ranked second among states where businesses are being created fastest. Agricultural powerhouse. National transportation hub. You can get anywhere in the world from here, between rail, between air, highways. Everything we have in abundance from that standpoint. Energy, fourth in crude oil refining capacity, second in recoverable coal reserves, number one in generating capacity from nuclear power, which remains an important source of power for us. And we've got some of the most prestigious higher ed institutions, University of Chicago, Northwestern. Not many states have two of the top 12. University of Illinois as well, and on down the line. We have a workforce here that U.S. Chamber of Commerce says people want to hire. They like our Midwestern work ethic and values. They like the fact that we are an educated, sophisticated workforce. So we have a lot to offer, but yet we can't deny these facts exist despite all of those advantages. We continue to lag nationally and regionally in job growth. I had a conversation with a well-placed member of the Rounder administration this morning. We were discussing jobs numbers and where we're at. If Illinois had kept pace with the national average, just average in job growth, and remember, think about average in the context of all those attributes we just ticked off. To be average, frankly, is a disappointing place with everything we have going for us. If we had just been average, we would be generating in state tax revenue about $2.25 billion more per year than we are right now, just from job growth and people actually working and having more taxpayers rather than higher tax rates. And if we were maximizing and we're in the top 10%, you're probably talking $3 to $4 billion. Just to put that into some context, each percentage point on the income tax rate is worth $1 billion a year. Lagging job growth, despite those attributes, really difficult to comprehend. And you have all heard this one. If you live in Illinois, every time I'm out, I get hit with this one as well. Every 5 minutes, Illinois loses another resident. How many of you have family and friends who have said, I'm not waiting for the turnaround anymore, I'm cutting bait on home and going where the opportunity is better. We hear it far too often, and it's important to start to address this because one of those main attributes is that people like our workforce. If the talented people here continue to decide they need to go somewhere else to make it work for them, eventually that's no longer a strength for us, so that remains a concern. We lose jobs and investors due to the unfriendly business climate. We'll address that a little bit. Lagging job growth. So, January of 15 to November of 15, look at the surrounding states. I always joke, Indiana, other than the dunes, Indiana doesn't have one thing that's better than we have here in Illinois, except for the fact that they get policy right. 52,000 to 20,000? I mean, that's Missouri, Iowa. It's incomprehensible to me that these states could be taking our lunch money the way they are. Manufacturing jobs, we're actually losing manufacturing jobs. This speaks, frankly, I think, to a large extent to our cost of doing business. Workers' compensation costs are a significant driver there, which I'll touch on in a little bit. But for us, given the transportation advantages that we've got, to be that hamstrung manufacturing-wise compared to neighboring states just doesn't add up. Unemployment rate chart, 5.7. Look at how we compare to all the neighbors. I was listening to an economist earlier this week, and when you add in the seasonal, the underemployment, and then the people who have just left the labor force, her estimate was, for that Illinois number, if you added those in, you're probably more at about 10.5 as an effective unemployment rate for Illinois. Out-migration we talked about a little bit. The shrinking population. See, this isn't just some thing that we make up to kick Illinois around. This is actually happening. And this is from the Census Bureau. So, these aren't trumped up numbers, but 22,000 net loss out-migration. And look at the states around it. People sometimes who want to apologize will say, well, it's the weather. Look at Minnesota. I mean, yeah, okay, maybe the weather's not ideal here. I wouldn't mind taking, say, January, February off of the calendar and go someplace warm, but Minnesota's getting 32.5 in growth, and we're at negative 22. So why is this happening? Why aren't we already dominating economically? I suspect many of you would have some pretty good answers right off the top of your tongue, and I'm willing to take the G-rated version of those once we're done here. But the pension liability. How many people have heard that we've got a little bit of a pension issue here in the state? So the budget right now, our general revenue funds budget, is probably about $37 billion. We owe 3 times that just in state pension liability. We have 40% of the money in the 5 state-administered pension systems that we need to make the obligations that are already there. That does not include the City of Chicago's pension liabilities. That does not include Cook County government's pension liabilities. It does not include other municipal, police, and fire issues. The budget deficit right now, in Springfield people use because we have a balanced budget requirement in the Constitution, we refer to it as a backlog of bills, which I absolutely refuse to refer to it as it's a deficit. By every other definition, it's a deficit. We're at about $4.6 billion of deficit just within the current fiscal year. That sort of budget instability is a significant deterrent to choosing to invest here, because people are going to want to know, of that $111 billion, what's my cut if I choose to come to Illinois? Of the 4.6, what's my cut? Just tell me what I'm going to owe. Give me some certainty. We have one of the highest average workers' compensation premium rates in the nation. There was a reform back in 2011 that brought us down. We were, I'll show you a chart in a little bit on that. Illinois, second highest property tax rate in the nation. That one is, I would say that's the number one thing I hear about from people in my suburban district, is that they want to jump out of a window twice a year when they get their property tax bill. So you've got an ongoing budget impasse, pension crisis, tax burdens on businesses. Investors and job creators legitimately question the stability and predictability of owning and operating a business in Illinois. We'll just touch on some of these a little bit. Look at this increase in pension unfunded liability. FY 2000, FY 2015, 613% increase. In FY 2000, it was $15 billion. Not ideal, but a walk in the park compared to the 111 we're at now. In the interim, you saw significant pension payments skipped. About 44% of the reason we have a $111 billion problem today is pension payments weren't made to the extent they were supposed to be. Another third of it was giving out more benefits without requiring that they be paid for by the employees. And then about the last quarter or so was just not getting the number right by not taking into account demographic changes and the fact that retirees live longer. So we actually did pass a pretty substantial pension reform bill a few years ago on a bipartisan basis. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional and struck it down and put us back at ground zero. Most recently this week, the governor and Senate President, I think, have come to an agreement on a bill. I don't know whether the Supreme Court will like this one any better, but it'll save us maybe $1 billion a year in what's about an $8 billion pension payment. It's projected to do so. Hopefully we can get some movement on that. It's not nearly enough, but we'll take $1 billion where we can find it. Pension consequences. I don't know if I have the stomach for that today. So where does the state get its money from? That's a little bit of a chart. Income tax obviously is the largest at almost half. Sales tax at 26. How many people thought that the lottery was going to solve every problem we were ever going to have with education? I am fascinated. So I got elected, I got sworn in 2007. I think the lottery that was pushed in the early 80s. And I don't think I go 6-8 weeks without somebody saying, why isn't the lottery money solving the education problem? Which what it tells me is Governor Thompson did one hell of a job of selling the lottery. Because he convinced people it was gonna do everything short of solving world hunger. But you can see how much money we get, about just under $700 million from the lottery. If you include local property tax money, state revenue, and federal money, statewide we spend about $30 billion on K through 12 education, and the lottery is $700 million. But you can see sort of the breakdown of where we get our money from. 10% that Medicaid match, that's federal tax dollars. But the bulk of it, frankly, is income and sales taxes. And here you can see we spend the vast majority of our money either on K through 12 and higher ed, Medicaid, and our pension payments. That is probably at least 2/3, if not 70% of our money is tied up in those programs. A couple of key stats on Medicaid. So Medicaid is the social safety net program for the poor and disabled. Look at a couple of these stats. Since fiscal year 2003, 1.7 million have been added to this social safety net program, an increase of 100%. What does that say about the overall health of the state? 1 of every 2 moms giving birth in Illinois need the welfare safety net to pay for the delivery. Medicaid's leapfrogged over K through 12 in the last decade to become the highest expenditure in the state. Now, we had some bipartisan reforms to Medicaid to kind of roll some of those costs back a little bit. We can't really afford to be more generous than the national average on eligibility, yet we have been. The governor wants to reinstate some of those that were rolled back. On his own, he's saved about $250 million this year in Medicaid reforms and tightening up, basically making sure that only people who are really eligible get it. He's been able to save some money there. Group health insurance, you've heard a lot about the governor negotiating with unions, state employee unions. One of the big areas he wants to try and save some money is in group health insurance. He's looking to save $700 million again out of a $36 billion budget. It's a significant number. It's part of the solution. He's actually been able to get about $170 million in savings through contract renegotiations. He's actually, for all the rhetoric about it, the governor has actually reached contracts with 17 different union bargaining groups this year. It's the largest state employees union, unfortunately, that thus far has been a holdout. So FY16 budget, where are we now? We're going to take in this year about $32 billion in revenue. We don't have a budget. Think about this. We don't have a budget passed. We're going to take in just under $32 billion. We are on pace without a budget to spend a little over $32 billion. Now, how do you think that makes us as legislators feel? We feel so unneeded and inadequate because you can spend this money without us. And it is going on. But the incredible thing is, probably 90% of the programs are being funded, whether it's from a federal court-ordered consent decree, a state order, bondholders. You know, we definitely want to reassure them, so they are in what we call a continuing appropriation. When we owe bond money, we don't have to pass a budget every year to make bond payments. We're just making bond payments. So if a situation like this occurs, we do not have the bond houses worrying that we're not going to pay them. Pension payments fall into that category. So we spend literally about 90% of the money right now, and then the governor signed the budget for K through 12, the K through 12 budget. So between what he signed, which was the K through 12 budget and the Teachers Retirement System pension funds, and everything else that's what we call on autopilot, we're actually already going to spend about $32 billion when that's a little bit more than we're going to take in. That leaves higher education, corrections, non-Medicaid social service providers as the main groups, and that's about $5 billion. So if we had a full budget, probably spend about $37 billion, and we've got a little less than 32 coming in. So you can see that does not add up, and there is going to be a reckoning. The governor's budget director has to put out a 3-year projection, and he's projecting that without either reforms to these spending programs like pensions and Medicaid or tax increase to bring in more money, we're on pace to have a $25 billion deficit off of about a $36 billion budget in about 3 years. So it is reaching crisis proportions. You know, one of the things the governor has been focused on is let's reform some of these underlying cost drivers, and let's reform some of the things that maybe make Illinois a less attractive place to come, so that maybe we can be one of those jobs leaders rather than one of the jobs laggards, and we can grow revenue that way. One of the ways we want us to go about doing that is workers' compensation reform. Look at how much more it costs per 100 hours of payroll in Illinois compared to Indiana, Missouri, and then look at some of the bigger states, Florida and Texas. That's a big cost on business. And when you look at manufacturing in particular, they're going to be more sensitive to work comp costs because of the nature of the business. So despite being located in the perfect spot, we're hurting on manufacturing in large part because of work comp costs. The nice thing is we are in a position to where we have, as recently as 2004, the number didn't get put in there, we were actually 23rd in the country in work comp costs. They passed what was called a reform bill, which means basically you can put the word reform in front of absolutely anything. What they did here was they took us from 23rd in costs in the country all the way up to number 2 by about 2010. There was a bill passed in 2011 that's brought us back down to 7. We can do a couple of things that can get us into the lower half of work comp costs that don't gut worker rights, that aren't going to leave people destitute, but will make us a more attractive place to do business. That's the kind of compromise I'm hoping we're going to see if things come together. Education funding, this has been particularly interesting of late. I don't know if any of you have heard that the Chicago public school system is on the verge of bankruptcy. The governor has proposed to try to take them back over. People forget, before 1995, the state actually had much more authority over the city of Chicago public schools. At that time, by the way, their pension fund was 100% funded. It is now nowhere near that. Forrest Claypool and the mayor and others have been suggesting that the reason they're going bankrupt is because the state government is taking advantage of the city of Chicago and not giving them their fair share. Now, I just want you to think for a second about who has been running state government during the period of time that the city of Chicago has apparently been taking advantage of. It's pretty consistently been three guys from Chicago the entire time. I mean, they have, and we've run the numbers on this, they have 19.4% of the students statewide, and they get about 37% of the state's education dollars. I can't fathom in what universe that constitutes being taken advantage of. Nonetheless, CPS is important because Chicago is important, and this has got to get fixed. I applaud the governor for wanting to do something on it. I hope that my friends in the legislature's response isn't just to say, let's keep doing everything the way we've been doing it at CPS, just give us more suburban and downstate money and everything will be fine, because that's clearly not the case. Taxes, so Wallet Hub, you know, one of the other difficult situations we face is the tax burden. That pension situation, 25% of our state budget goes to make the pension payment. In most states, it's 5 to 8%. You know, 25% of $32 billion is $8 billion. If we were down in the 5% range, that's $6 billion more that we would have either to keep tax rates where they are and also to fund our not-for-profits and balance our budget. Pension reform has to happen if this is going to be sustainable. The problem is, with what the Supreme Court did throwing pension reform out, you've got this big nut to pay every year, and we already are one of the higher tax states in the country. So going and raising tax rates comes at a price. It comes at a price of our competitiveness and threatens those very tax dollars you're chasing. The flip side is the not-for-profits, the developmentally disabled and mentally ill, they frankly can't really take any more of the abusive side of the relationship they've had with state government for the last 15 years. It is going to be a difficult needle to thread, to say the least. And then, of course, property taxes, second highest in the nation, as we touched on. So, what's this fight all about in Springfield? Why is this happening? There's a couple different visions for how Illinois ought to operate. And, you know, the governor wants, basically, he wants to tackle the things that are scaring the job creators away, take care of that pension debt, stabilize this budget, and bring the high cost of doing business down. This is going to require that we really tackle some sacred cows and do some substantive reforms. And, you know, what we're hearing so far from the speaker is, just put the tax rate back where it was and everything will be fine. Well, taxes were raised without any reforms in 2011. Did I miss the huge change to the better for the state in the interim? I don't think I did. So, look, if a tax increase is going to be a part of this equation, and the governor has said in the interest of compromise, he would sign one if he gets some reforms that change the underlying problems that drive this. If we are going to have to ask people for more money, you better show them that you're not just paying more for the same product. Because there wouldn't even be a governor around if it weren't for the fact that people recognize you can't keep doing things in this state the way you've been doing them, because it isn't working. So I like to kind of go back to the positive and think about all of those good things that this state still has going for us. And imagine being one of the people who gets to sell a new Illinois, or I should say market, sell is a bad connotation here. Imagine if you addressed the things that scared people away, the things that made people move out, your family and friends move out, the things that made people on site selections for companies not even put Illinois on the list in the first dealt with those things and got to focus on and say, hey, everything that scared you away, we've addressed. Now let's look at all the things that make Illinois unique and special and great and why you want to be here. You go from a bottom 10 states in the country job growth state to a top 10, and this entire dynamic changes. That would be an incredible outcome. And just, and think about what that means for people who live here. Think about their increased opportunity to get the best job they're capable of doing. On down the line, everything gets easier. We have a more philanthropic society that is in a better position to share. We have a state government that can pay its bills timely and can be a good partner to the not-for-profits who take care of the developmentally disabled and mentally ill. We can be a state government that actually is one worthy of the respect of the people who live here. To me, that's what this whole fight is all about. And again, I wish we weren't having it. I wish this could be done more peacefully through some compromise. I've seen the governor be willing to compromise. He came in with 80 agenda items. He's an ambitious guy. He had right to work on his list. And the supermajority Democrat legislature, they were crawling out of their skin at the notion of the right to work. He said, all right, let's take it off the table. But you can't just ask the guy who was sent here by people who said, well, you can't keep doing things the same way, to just go ahead and roll over and keep doing things the same way. It's not reasonable. I'm encouraged this week by the Senate President stepping out of the shadow of the Speaker and saying, let's get a pension deal done, and the governor reached back and said, yeah, let's do that. I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to do more of those things. This same group of leaders, by the way, a year ago, maybe in March, came together to balance last fiscal year's budget. When Governor Romero took over, Governor Quinn had left him a rather substantial pile of deficit in last year's budget when the tax rate fell. They balanced that budget with a new deal in March and resulted in $1 billion surplus by the end of the fiscal year at the end of June. So they've established that they can work together. I'm hoping that there's going to be more of that. But we have got to address the things that chase people away from being here. Now, if I had to predict, unfortunately, and again, I think the Senate Democrats would negotiate with the governor, and I think the Senate President established that this week. Speaker Madigan, who I refer to as the most ironically titled man in the history of titles because he doesn't say too much, he appears, and again, this is my opinion, he appears focused politically on the November election and the defeat of Governor Romero 2 years after that. And he's not with the Senate Democrats yet in terms of trying to find common ground on the legitimate philosophical differences between the two sides. I don't know when he's going to change his focus from politics to policy. But to be honest, a broader deal that could be done, that could do a lot of good for a lot of people, is being held hostage by that very focus of one individual in Springfield. So until that changes, it's going to be difficult because I just think it's unreasonable to ask the governor to roll over and completely capitulate and just raise taxes and don't do anything else. So we're going to be at this for a little while. I think there are some really good things that can happen once that dam breaks, but it's going to be difficult. I do think you should expect a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. I want to suggest to you that tax increases are coming about as much as I want to pass a stone. But I'm trying to give you an honest assessment of what I think is coming. And I think that will be, when you're talking about a $5 billion difference between revenue now and natural spending pressures, again, until you can reform that pension system, until you can reform Medicaid, until you can get some of these larger cost drivers under control, the places you need to go to cut spending are places, to be honest, most people don't want to go. And it's taking care of seniors, it's taking care of the developmentally disabled and mentally ill. Those are the people who have been really bearing the brunt of cuts in the last few years. So you're likely to see a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. And I just hope, if that's the way it is, that the stability that's provided outweighs the cost of doing business increase. And of course, if you can do work comp reform, maybe you can bring the cost of doing business down to offset the tax increase to some extent. But it's unprecedented times right now. It's a fight worth having. I just hope it doesn't go on too terribly long, because it does come with a price. But with that, I am happy to take any questions, and I very much appreciate being asked back.
Senator, regarding the pension situation, we've been told in the public that the rights of the pensions for the state workers is baked into the Constitution, and therefore it's become very difficult to reform. How common is that practice among the other states, and is there a chance for significant reform there?
Embedding some level of protection for pensioners into the Constitution is not uncommon. I don't know whether quite half of the states do it, but a substantial plurality of the states do it. Our language in our 1970 Constitution protecting pensions is probably as strong as any in the country. I think it was made that way probably just to the extent that they thought about it, just as a deterrent to skipping payments, because skipping payments had actually been a problem before then. So the proposal that's being put forth now is actually really the Senate President's concept of what he wanted to do when we passed the bill that the Supreme Court threw out. There is a legitimate question whether this one will be constitutional too. I would like to see us, frankly, amend the Constitution to take the pension protection clause out. I don't think you could retroactively impact anybody's benefits. So if you're a retiree, you're not going to change anything. If you're a current employee who's in what we call Tier 1, meaning you started working before 2011, I don't think we could change your work benefit, your retirement benefits for any time up to whatever the effective change is. But, and the governor proposed this last year in his budget address, if we took that line out of the Constitution and we amended the state's contracts clause, we would potentially be able to say, okay, for the rest of your career, you have your Tier 1 pension for everything you've done to date. But tomorrow, and for the rest of your career, you go into what we call Tier 2, which is for everyone who came in after 2011, and is a much more affordable program for taxpayers. We can't actually roll people, like the private sector did that across the board 25 years ago. You know, so it's not unlike what everybody else is having to live with. You get what you get. It's actually even a better deal, because a lot of private employees, when the pension deal went bust on them, they lost the pension deal, and maybe they're getting something from the federal program now that's pennies on the dollar. This, you'd still get everything you got to this point, but tomorrow you go into a more affordable program. The governor's numbers on that last year were that would save us $2.5 to $3 billion out of our budget, reducing that pension payment from 8 to maybe 5.5 or 5. That's real money. I filibustered you all to sleep. Thank you all very much. Yeah.
If I could ask, because I think we still have a little bit of time, and unfortunately for some of the folks that are coming from outside of Illinois, to come here and hear this, as far as the economic climate, which I don't think speaks to the opportunities here.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Ronner having a 2-year, sort of time frame, maybe to really be in a position to look back and say, did anything happen, or is it just more of the same? And I know you've indicated you're encouraged by certain things. What's your prediction for where we are 2 years from now?
Can you repeat that, Senator?
Yeah, he wants sort of a prediction of where we're going to be 2 years from now.
Hold the account.
Yeah. My fear for a little while has been, not unlike other situations where you have divided government. I mean, just like in Washington, they passed a budget for the first time, I think, in 5 years since, there was a Democratic president and a Republican legislature. It's sort of a divided time, and when you have divided government, you're not seeing a lot of productivity. My fear is you're going to see fits and starts of productivity out of Illinois government through the next, at least through November, if not through November of 18, when one side or the other thinks they're about to be blamed for something. So I'm not terribly optimistic that this is going to get resolved meaningfully before the voters weigh in one or two more times.
Senator, you mentioned that Governor Romero was okay with possibly raising the income tax rate or the tax rates as long as there was reforms being made. And I heard you right, the Speaker mandated was against some of these reforms. Can you be a little bit more specific as to what those
Yeah, sure. So at this point, like I said, the governor started with literally about 80 things on his list. He kind of whittled it down to 4. He wants property tax freeze and the corresponding collective bargaining reforms in local government to allow those units of government to be able to sustain it. The contracts of local governments drive a lot of the spending by local governments, and local governments are who take your property tax dollars. So he wants to freeze the property taxes and give those units of local government what they need tools-wise to be able to afford it. Workers' compensation reform is another big reform. CPS, the takeover of CPS, the pension deal is another one. Again, things that can stabilize, bring the cost of doing business under control, stabilize our budget process. Then more governmentally, redistricting reform. One of the reasons why it's tough for voters to really assert their will is because the majority draws the legislative map. And in 2014, in races where there was both a Republican and a Democrat to choose from for the Illinois House of Representatives, the Republican got, I want to say, statewide collectively about 52% of the vote. But due to the map drawing, the Democrats control 60% of the seats. So it is made very difficult to change the House midterm. Frankly, and this process is done by both parties all over the country. It's been done by both parties here. It really is disrespectful to voters, and really it polarizes our politics even more, because there are districts that are drawn for one party or the other in a general election, which means the only way someone can lose in one of those elections is in a primary. And when the only way you can lose in a primary, your incentive to reach across the aisle and compromise is diminished, because that's the only way you can be fired. So redistricting reform is another, and then the last thing on the list is term limits, which might have been motivated by the speaker.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, obviously corporate America has dealt with pensions and debt in several different ways. I think we saw United Airlines deal with it. Obviously, we saw Detroit potentially deal with it. Any of those types of things considered for maybe CPS or City of Chicago or State of Illinois, either to get rid of contracts and start over, or to maybe eliminate some debt?
Well, it's a great question. The state of Illinois cannot access bankruptcy court because the federal law creating bankruptcy court doesn't allow sovereign states to do it. But local units of government can. So you've seen Detroit, you've seen Stockton, a number of them do that. And they've shaken off some debt. To me, and again, I haven't studied it thoroughly enough to really say for sure that I like the idea. But I don't think we have to fear bankruptcy in Chicago quite as much, because Chicago's not Detroit. We have a lot more strength here and a lot more positives here. I think the debt is a bigger issue than maybe in Detroit in terms of the size of it. If we could shake off some of that debt, maybe we're a little more attractive destination because of the strengths that are here. The CPS thing, I found it fascinating that the head of the teachers union in Chicago had been telling Ron Emanuel, I am not negotiating with you on anything. I got my strike all lined up. I beat you last time, and I'm going to beat you again, was basically her attitude. Rauner comes in and says, you know what, maybe we'll take that system over and you can talk with me when I have the authority to push you into bankruptcy. And bankruptcy, of course, extinguishes the contracts. Like that, within days of that conversation starting. She said, you know what, maybe there's a couple of things on the pension pickup we can negotiate on. It got better right away. And I think that can be a positive out of this thing too. But look, it's a major issue facing the state because Chicago is hugely important to the state of Illinois. So if you don't like the governor's idea on that, that's fine. Come up with something that works, other than just telling everybody else to pay more for a broken system. Yes, sir.
Is there a day of reckoning that will come?
Ray, hold on, Bernie's got a microphone here. Thanks.
Is there a day of reckoning that will come when either Speaker Madigan or Governor Rauner must give in, otherwise something really, really bad will happen?
I honestly don't know. The things that we don't know, is there are events that are not foreseen that come about all the time that all of a sudden take something that looked intractable and melted away. And you hate to speculate on it because usually they're horrible. Is it a bridge collapse in Minnesota? Whatever the case may be, and you hate to think in those terms. But right now, honestly, I look at Mike Madigan right now, and I see a guy who has literally been the Speaker of the House since I was in 7th grade. There is an air of entitlement to him that he's become imperious in all candor. And he has everything he wants and needs. So he doesn't need anything from anybody. And because he has a supermajority in the House, he can kill anything anybody else wants. So he is in a position where he feels very emboldened. And the collateral damage that is being caused by this fight, he seems somewhat impervious to today. And when is any of that going to change? Historically, the only thing that moves him, the only times he moves, are when he wants to, or when he's afraid he's going to get his majority threatened. That's been it. And on the Rauner side, so far what Rauner has been offered is capitulate completely and ask us to raise the tax rates again, and we'll let you out of this mess. Because you're the governor and you're the one who's going to be blamed the most. And he's not going to do that, and I don't think he should. Because to do that would be basically to say to all of the people who said, we're not going to keep doing it that way anymore, we're going to put a new guy in. It's going to be to tell them either I couldn't do it or it can't be done, so give up. And it's just, let's go right back to full speed ahead toward that cliff. And I don't think either of those is a good place for the state of Illinois going forward. So I hope he doesn't do that. Now that doesn't mean he shouldn't compromise, and he has indicated that he will. But the contrast between the Democratic Senate President and the Democratic House Speaker, I think, is significant. The Senate Democrats are ideologically much more liberal, I think, than the House Democrats, and yet they're more likely to cooperate and compromise with the Republican governor than the House is. And I think it's largely because this is a power struggle in the eyes of the Speaker. And until he feels like that's got to change, we're all left wondering when that's going to happen. Yes? You'd be surprised that there are some on the other side of the aisle who don't see it quite exactly the way I do.
Quick question. Some other states have gone to kind of neutral commissions on districting, redistricting their legislative areas throughout the whole state. They'll go to a separate party. I know it's probably tough in this state given the supermajority, but is there any movement, desire, opportunity to go to some kind of neutral body to stop the jerry-rigging in our state?
No, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was remiss in not giving that information when I talked about it before. This requires an amendment to the Constitution. In almost every example, to amend the state constitution, you need to go through the General Assembly with a vote, unless you're doing something that affects the General Assembly. So there is currently a petition drive underway to get on the ballot a change to the process and how the maps are drawn, and effectively, largely take it out of the hands of the legislature and the governor where it is now, and more into the hands of an independent commission, as you suggest, as other states have done. So I believe it's called Fair Maps. You can look them up, but they are gathering petition signatures to get on the ballot. They need to have those by pretty much the end of April. And assuming the Supreme Court, says that it complies with the Constitution, and again, it's been an issue in the past, but hopefully this time it wouldn't be. There's the potential you could see that on the ballot in November, which would be a really positive outcome. Thank you all very much.